Okay, simple summary about the Vietnam War. This, again, is an incredibly complicated issue. I don't know if I can distill it. Good luck to me. Um, Vietnam in the 1950s was still a colonial possession of France. It was one of the last vestiges of European colonial control in Asia. And the French were fighting a military intervention to keep the country, and the Vietnamese were essentially rebelling against French control. The United States questionably supported the French, but the French, again, to oversimplify, lost and withdrew. And so the North and the South of Vietnam continued to be separate, continued to fight, the North being supported by the communists, especially in the Soviet Union, the South being supported to some extent by the United States. By the time Kennedy became president in 1961, the situation had deteriorated, and so Kennedy sent advisors. He sent about 15,000, I don't know the exact number, it's a little higher, a little lower. But he sent soldiers there not to fight, but to advise our South Vietnamese allies how to fight. And by the time President Kennedy died in November of 1963, he had not definitively decided, apparently, as far as we know, what to do about Vietnam. It was not a good situation. What President Johnson chose to do was to escalate American involvement and eventually start actually fighting on behalf of South Vietnam. And at the high point, there were about 500,000 American troops. It's a full-scale war to preserve South Vietnam's government. And how can I put this? It was a very confused effort. I was privileged to know a person named Gordon Sullivan, who was a general in the U.S. Army, who was an alum of the school where I used to work full-time. And you'll see his picture in the module. He served in Vietnam. And when I interviewed him for a course that we built for Norwich, he talked about his experiences there. And this is a very reasonable, mild-mannered, straightforward, polite gentleman. And he said, from his time that he served there, 2 different tours in Vietnam, I could never figure out what the hell we were supposed to be doing. And I think that, in a way, sums up a lot of the American effort in Vietnam. A lot of it didn't make sense. At the end of the day, as President Kennedy did say before his assassination, that we could help people, but in the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. And having Americans fighting instead of the South Vietnamese was a situation that really could not endure. And you can understand why Johnson would keep escalating the war. He wasn't just like power hungry or wanted to kill people. He was, this is in the larger context of the Cold War. And we believed, when I say we, the US government, the United States, largely believed in what's called the domino theory, which is, if you let this nation fall to the communists, then the next one will fall, and the next one will fall, and the next one will fall. And so really what it is it's the people who lived through World War II, who saw Hitler pick off a country and another country and another country and another country, unopposed, in which the British, the French, whoever could have done things about it and didn't do anything about it until it was too late. But the problem with that is, it's a different situation. You're learning the wrong lessons from history. The domino theory doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think about it, right? Because Vietnam did fall in 1975. Do you see communist governments popping up in Japan or Korea or other? No, these countries are relatively unrelated. The Vietnam War tore the United States apart. There were mass protests. People burned their draft cards. They refused to serve. The people who did serve were drafted into the war. I mean, a lot of people enlisted, but mostly people were drafted and forced to fight in this war that they didn't believe in, and so they didn't honestly make very good soldiers as a result. Um, there were, again, a lot of protests about it. There were a lot of deferments. If you were a college student, you could get a deferment. It means you didn't have to go. Or if you were a certain age, you could get a deferment. Or if you worked in certain industries, you could get a deferment. And what that meant is basically the powerful people didn't bother to go to Vietnam and fight. The powerful and the wealthy and the rich didn't go. And the ordinary Americans and poor Americans and people of color disproportionately were all drafted and sent to Vietnam. And there's a basic lack of fairness in that. And that also contributed to the protests and the marches. And in early 64 and in 65, Johnson was still popular. But the worse that the war got, the worse were his political fortunes. And by 1968, there were people camped outside of the White House 24/7 chanting and screaming and yelling, and he couldn't go anywhere in public without the protests. And the frequent chant that he heard late at night when he was trying to sleep was "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And the war consumed him. If you look at him in 64 and 65, he's still vibrant, got a lot of energy. A lot of the photographs you see of him in 67, there's a famous one of him sitting in the White House. I think it might have been in the cabinet room, and he's just slumped over and holding his head. It took enormous strain on him, but then again, he wasn't the one fighting the war. It's hard to describe how much it tore the country apart. And by 1968, it was the dominant issue in the upcoming presidential campaign. President Kennedy's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, had been his attorney general, and then later was elected senator from the state of New York. And people were pushing him to run for president in 68, mainly to try to get the United States out of Vietnam. And he resisted, so another senator, a man named Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota, jumped in to run against Johnson. And eventually Kennedy ran as well. And the pressure from this and just overall tiredness caused Johnson to withdraw from the race in March of 1968. Kennedy was then assassinated in June. The Vice President Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee, but lost in November to former Vice President Richard Nixon. So Nixon came into office in January of 69, and he inherited the Vietnam War. Now, again, I'm looking at 8 minutes. Let me see how quickly I can distill this. The war went on for another almost 4 years. I personally think Nixon would have liked to wrap it up sooner. He gradually drew the troops down. He tried to pressure the North Vietnamese to negotiate, but that was not terribly successful. Eventually, they did. The basic strategy of the North Vietnamese was, like any revolting country that's in revolt, same as the Americans in the revolution in 1775. It's not really to win. It's just to make the enemy so exhausted that they eventually go home. The North Vietnamese knew that the United States wasn't going to stay there forever. It just was too unpopular. It was too costly in money and blood. They knew that they had to just hang in there as long as they could, and eventually the United States would leave. And that's essentially what happened. Nixon essentially made the best deal that he could. American entry in the war, or American involvement in the war, largely concluded in 72 and 73. The South was not strong enough to stand up to the North on its own, and so South Vietnam fell in 1975. And it just sort of ended with a whimper rather than a bang. And the long-term effects of Vietnam were more on the American psyche than anything else. It undermined American confidence in its military. It divided people in ways. It planted a lot of seeds of division that we see now. There was more mistrust between cultural conservatives and liberals. It it had profound effects, and some of which are still being felt today. That is probably an inadequate summary of it. Again, you're taking something that deserves its own course, honestly, and trying to turn it into a 10-minute video. But those are the basic events that you can write a summary of and answer the questions about it. Okay, bye-bye.